I want to first thank our founding sponsor of our business forum, Delta Airlines. We could not do this without you. You're allowing us to have some of these really in-depth conversations that have been really illuminating so far. So thank you for that. I also first want to introduce our panelists, Jeff Graham, Executive Director of Georgia Equality. Jeff, thank you for being here today. Really appreciate that. We also have Gabrielle Claiborne, co-founder of and CEO of Transformation Journeys Worldwide. And we also have Fred Smith Jr., Associate Professor at Emory University School of Law. Thank you, Fred, for being here today. And I wanted to give you all a chance to chat a little bit about your organization first, in case there's anybody on Facebook Live or is joining the webinar who may not know as much as they should about your organization. Jeff, I thought we'd start off with you.
Thanks, Ryan, and it's great to be with everyone today on a very exciting election day here in Georgia. So Georgia Equality is a statewide group. Our mission is to advance fairness, safety, and opportunity for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities throughout the state of Georgia. So we are very busy this election season. We work on elections, we work on policy, we work on legislation.
Thank you, Jeff. And Gabrielle, do you want to go next and chat a little bit about your organization?
Sure. Thank you for including me in this conversation today, Ryan. It's great to be associated with these fine gentlemen. And yeah, I am the co-founder and CEO of Transformation Journeys Worldwide. We're an inclusion training and consulting firm with a transgender focus. So we help a myriad of organizations, with corporate America being our bread and butter, how to transform their environments into fully trans and non-binary inclusive culture. So as Jeff said, today, today is an exciting day for us, especially in the work that we're doing in advancing workplace equality and organizational equality, wherever that client is along their journey.
Thank you so much for being here today. And Fred, do you want to chat a little bit about your time and your work at Emory University? And Fred, I think you might be on mute like I was earlier.
Indeed, I am. Sorry about that. And also sorry for not getting you a post-COVID hair headshot.
No worries.
It's very stark when it shows up. But yes, so I am a professor at Emory Law School. I teach constitutional law, federal courts, and also local government. And I'm delighted to speak about legal issues in relationship to today's discussion.
So, Fred, thank you so much for joining us today. And I think you're going to be able to help illuminate some of the questions that I have. And I want to mention to the folks that are viewing us that they can certainly use the Q&A chat function if they have some questions as we have this hour to chat. You know, Jeff, I wanted to chat briefly about some of the things that Georgia Equality is trying to do in regards to helping people exercise their right to vote.
Yeah, so Georgia Equality actually is a part of a couple of different consortiums of groups, if you will. One works strictly in a nonpartisan 501c3 manner, and that is a group called Pro Georgia, 38 organizations. And we have been working very diligently, frankly, most of the year to register folks to vote, get people out in the primaries, and especially this year as the primary dates were evolving and changing. For a while there, almost on a weekly basis, making sure that people understood when to vote. But then both in the primary and now in the general election, we've been very focused on helping people understand how to vote. So we have actually worked with a universe of about 400,000 registered voters in Georgia. These are members of the LGBT community. These are folks in our own email membership list, as well as a lot of folks that, due to some modeling that is available to us, we feel are going to be supportive to understanding and supportive of LGBTQ issues in general. And so created this universe, about 400,000 folks with a heavy emphasis on people of color, newly registered folks, and people who have never voted in a general election before. So frankly, a lot of folks on this webinar may have been part of our text messaging program. So through phone calls, through text messages, through emails, we started back in August, letting people know about the importance of voting by mail, how to get their application in, understanding the deadlines to get the applications in if folks were interested in voting by mail. And then certainly as the early voting period opened up so that people could come and vote early in person, that then we segment this out by county so that people can get linked to their county office. We use the state website, the My Voter page, to direct people for information on this, encouraging people to come out and vote early. And then the last few days, especially here in the Metro Atlanta area, there have been a number of counties, Fulton, DeKalb, very specifically, that in an effort to keep lines today short, have opened up literally hundreds of brand new voting locations and precincts for voting day today. And while ultimately that is a good thing and we appreciate them doing that, that also could lead to a lot of confusion if voters were unaware that their precincts may have changed at the last moment. So we've been really focused on making sure that people know that those changes have taken place. So that's kind of what we're doing in the nonpartisan space. We have actually been doing some stuff on the C4 side and the PAC side to support candidates that we feel are going to be best placed to advance our policy agenda on a local and a state level should they win office. So we also have been supporting some endorsed candidates in that way as well.
Well, incredible work. And we are so appreciative of all the work that Georgia Equality does. And based on all that, do you feel hopeful about where we're at?
I am always hopeful about where we're at. I've been doing this for a long time, and frankly, I will start off with the very fact that Georgia is in play. That to have, I think Jim Galloway, I'm going to quote from him, or actually, I guess it was a Politico piece on Stacey Abrams, to go from Doug to Obama. So having Kamala Harris's husband here a couple of weeks ago as a surrogate in a rally, then Jill Biden, then to have Kamala Harris herself come out this past weekend, to have Joe Biden here in Georgia, in Macon, or in Warm Springs, as well as here in Atlanta last week in the closing days, and then last night to have former President Obama here to rally folks around this election. It is frankly remarkable. We have not had that sort of enthusiasm from federal office holders, people running for president since 1992. And frankly, I would say there wasn't even that much generation from Bill Clinton coming through the state in 1992 as what we're seeing this year. So clearly Georgia is in play. It's been a long time coming. There's a lot of folks that have been working very diligently, very specifically for the last 8 years, to build this sort of grassroots network of voters, to educate them, to get them registered, and to get them out and voting in the hopes that Georgia will begin to be a national player and not just a flyover state. President Trump also has been here multiple times, including as recently as this past weekend. And so for the president to come to Georgia shows that even he and his campaign are not taking Georgia for granted. And so regardless of who ultimately wins the presidential vote in Georgia, Georgia has changed. And we will not be going backwards at this point in time. We are solidly a national player. And I'm sorry for all those folks that hate seeing the TV ads. It's just going to get worse in the years to come. But frankly, that means that people will be paying attention to Georgia voters, and what the issues that we care most about. And as LGBTQ folks, I think that that's an extremely good, strong position for a southern state like Georgia to be in.
It's an exciting moment for sure, and we'll be all watching anxiously tonight to see how this affects the future of Georgia. We're certainly, like you said, now definitely at least a purple state for sure. So that's exciting, especially like you said, when it comes to other issues that we care about. Gabrielle, do you want to tell me a little bit, in your opinion, what might be on the minds of transgender Americans when it comes to this election? Also, Georgians who are wanting to make sure that their voice is heard.
Yeah, it's a great question, Ryan, because, we have to start by looking at the lack of access and even the barriers of trans and gender nonconforming people even getting to the polls, right? I mean, thanks to the work that Jeff and Georgia Equality are doing across the state, making sure that we understand how to navigate the nuances. For example, if a trans or gender nonconforming individual doesn't have their legal documents fully aligned, I mean, they're literally outing themselves when they go to the poll to register, right? So that stress that a TGNC individual feels and experiences just showing up to cast their vote, which we all have a right to do, is stressful, right? But then it's just not showing up to vote. It's making sure that your vote is going to be counted and weighed, right? I mean, think about, and I don't know if anyone on the call understand, or a lot of our listeners understand, but the Trump-Pence administration has actually created over 70 plus acts of discrimination against the TGNC community. So for transgender nonconforming individuals, this election is a matter of life and death. This directly impacts our health and well-being. It's in areas like workplace equity, healthcare equity, even attacking trans and gender nonconforming students in school, not allowing them to participate in sports, and then criminalizing a trans child from gaining access to life-affirming healthcare. So it's these kind of things that the transgender nonconforming individual is showing up to the poll in hopes that there's going to be some shift in our leadership. But here's the thing: it's not just us casting our vote. Those who love us, those who care for us, also have to be mindful of that. Their vote is not just for them; their vote is also for, the demographic like ours. So being mindful of that when you go to the poll, I think is going to make a huge difference in this year's election. And oh, by the way, it's not just a federal election, it's a local and state election. So there's many implications here to this year's election for the TGNC community.
Thank you for that. And I think that's really, important for us to think about and recognize, is just, in addition to the disenfranchisement that a lot of LGBTQ people have felt just in general, set aside election day, the fact that transgender and gender nonconforming folks have to, like you say, out themselves potentially at polling locations is another hurdle. What would be some of your suggestions for folks who are worried about those kinds of issues?
Well, definitely follow the guidance that Georgia Equality has put in place. And if you're uncomfortable going to the poll on your own, I would suggest finding someone to go with you to support you, right? I know that there are poll watchers there and they're watching things closely, but making sure that you have someone that can be there to support you so that you're not having to shoulder all of this on your own. I think that was probably the biggest recommendation that I would make. And then the other thing is like, this is an invitation for a TGNC individual to get their legal documents fully aligned so that they can show up authentically in the poll and not have to worry about, that unrest feeling of, being outed or being, even denied the opportunity to cast your vote.
Thank you for that. That's a really good point. Always bringing friends to the polls is, I think, a smart idea. Fred, I wanted to pivot to you. Given the recent makeup of the Supreme Court, what LGBTQ advancements are at most immediate risk, in your opinion?
I'd say an expansion of what's meant by the words religious liberty would be something to particularly watch. And we're going to get our first glimpse of that tomorrow in a case called Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. That particular case involves a contract between the City of Philadelphia and an organization that helps, or that in the past has helped Philadelphia deliver foster care services. And Philadelphia terminated that contract because that agency doesn't subscribe to the city's non-discrimination policy. So the city prohibits discrimination on the basis of race and sex and among other things, sexual orientation. This particular agency would like to refuse to consider same-sex couples, including same-sex married couples. And so the city terminated the contract. And what the agency is saying is that violates their religious liberty. Under the First Amendment, they have a First Amendment right to discriminate. They've lost in the lower courts, but the Supreme Court has decided to take on this case. And there's some signals from Justice Alito and Justice Thomas in particular from a recent opinion that they wrote a few weeks ago, in which they expressed a great deal of concern about Obergefell itself, the case that recognized that same-sex couples have an equal protection right to marry. They expressed a lot of concerns about that, and in particular, they focused in on their concerns about what it means for religious liberty. And in that particular case, part of what's at stake is actually a case that was written by Justice Scalia from the early 1990s. And under that case, when there's a law that is generally applicable, right, that it's a law that doesn't focus in on any particular religion, it applies to everyone the same, but it happens to burden one particular religion, then that's not going to typically give rise to a strong First Amendment claim. So in that particular case, there were drug laws and that prohibited, among other things, the use of peyote. And there was a group of religious individuals for whom they said that smoking peyote was important to their religious faith. But the Supreme Court said that that case didn't discriminate on the basis of religion because it wasn't targeted at any specific religion. In this particular case, the agency in Philadelphia is challenging that particular set of precedents. So they're taking it all on. They're expressly asking the Supreme Court to revisit that, which could have wide implications, not only in the foster care arena, which is important, but for public accommodations, for hard-won employment discrimination protections, including the hard ones that we just won a few months ago in the Bostock case. This could particularly because this is framed as a constitutional issue, it could, I'm trying not to use hyperbole here, so I will say it would substantially undermine all anti-discrimination protections that include sexual orientation, and maybe even, we don't know where this ends, it could also undermine protections more broadly for gender, for race, who knows? And so that's certainly something to keep an eye on, and I think it's the most immediate, to answer your question, it's the most immediate because it's literally on the Supreme Court's docket tomorrow.
So there's a lot at stake. It sounds like even in some ways, regardless of who wins this election, because of the makeup of the Supreme Court in the immediate term, this is the level set with what we're dealing with, correct? In terms of where this could go.
That's correct, right? And so part of why this election is so important is that there are judges beyond the Supreme Court, right? There are lower court judges, there are state court judges. And so it's important to make sure that the courts don't continue to be packed in one direction, and that instead they have more balance. I also think that, frankly, if Donald Trump is no longer the president, I think that there'll be a conversation about whether the courts are sufficiently balanced and what should it look like in order to achieve more balance in light of the packing that has taken place in recent years. But if Democrats lose the Senate or the White House, I think we'll continue to see a great deal of packing toward one side. It would not surprise me at all if there's a President Biden and a Republican Senate, if they do to federal judges what they did to Merrick Garland, which is to say, we just won't give you a hearing, right? Which is a pretty aggressive form of packing, but one that they've shown themselves to be interested in. Even in 2016, there were senators who are on record as saying that if Hillary Clinton were elected, that they thought that 8 justices was enough, and that they were uninterested in giving any of her nominees a hearing too. So that's a very aggressive form of hacking, and we have to have a serious conversation about how to have more balance in light of that history of hacking.
It's important to know, and also the fact that a number of lower court judges have been appointed in recent years. I think over 100. Is that correct? I think McConnell has pushed a lot of them through.
That sounds right. I mean, my understanding is that it's about, at this point, it's about a third of all active appellate court judges in the country were appointed by one particular president.
So in regards to what's happening politically, Jeff, I think one of the things that we know is that oftentimes businesses have been out front trying to help steer some of the conversation towards more equitable practices for their LGBTQ employees, but also their consumers. How does a business navigate what comes next?
Well, I think businesses, first and foremost, need to be paying attention and need to be looking at the long game with this. So establishing strong policies that protect their own employees, that protect their own customers, that is a baseline that should not even be a point of discussion anymore, as far as I'm concerned. I think that the business community, going back well over 2 decades, we've seen diversity and inclusion efforts expand to more and more communities, covering more and more employees. And over the last half dozen years or so, we've seen a specific emphasis not just on support of LGBTQ employees and customers, but actually seeing the business community speak out. So we saw here locally, of course, a lot of the business community, ultimately over 600 Georgia-based businesses that spoke out against the bad religious liberty legislation, the RFRA legislation that had been introduced here in Georgia. But we've seen on a national level a number of these important national companies begin to weigh in on these Supreme Court decisions by filing friend of the court briefs, just talking about the environment that they operate in as businesses and why they have taken this step to protect their employees, but they can only protect their employees and their customers during business hours. And more, it is incumbent upon these big corporations to use their political muscle to protect people where they live, where they do business, where they raise families. It's about recruitment and retention of top talent, but it's also about making a statement for positive quality of life communities in which their employees and their customers live. And so that's all a good thing. But I think in the coming years, we need to begin to pressure them even more to look not just at federal races and weighing in on a national level, but weighing in proactively on local issues, local ordinances, and support of local ordinances. Frankly, a lot of the business community still gives significant amounts of dollars through their own political action committees, and that is skewed towards incumbents. And here in Georgia, that means it is skewed towards Republicans. Those dollars and corporate support need to be more evenly spread out. And frankly, I think they need to be very aware that sometimes they are backing people that don't have the best interest of marginalized communities in Georgia, not just the LGBT community, but immigrant communities, people of color, in some instances even not the interests of women, of people from a more geographic diverse area in mind. And so we've worked a lot with the business community. A lot of the pushback over the years that we've gotten is that they don't want to be supportive of another right to action, that the federal Civil Rights Act is enough. But we remain in dialogue with them to get them to understand that these court challenges on a federal level, and especially with the Supreme Court as conservative as it is right now, the federal court system, we need to ensure that our rights are protected on the local level. And that requires support of local candidates who are going to prioritize our protection, our civil rights, our human rights when they act.
Do you see corporations viewing organizations like Georgia Equality as a key partner in helping move legislators that would, be willing to support them in enhancing their business in a variety of ways? But one of the sticking points is they, might not be totally understanding LGBTQ issues. Will businesses, do you think, start to view organizations like Georgia Equality even more so as a partner?
Well, we're not exactly where I would like it to be. Again, we've had great support from the corporate community in saying no to really bad legislation. I think everybody understands why that can cause problems for the business environment and the state of the reputation of the state of Georgia as a whole. What we have been saying for a long time is the better way to counterbalance that is to ensure that we have protections on the state and local level. Georgia, along with Alabama and Mississippi, is one of only 3 states that does not offer state-level civil rights protections for any group of people. That puts our state reputation in jeopardy all the time. And we saw that earlier this year with corporate support of the hate crime law here in Georgia. They when we needed them to speak out, they did speak out. They spoke out in terms of the need to ensure that it was inclusive. We saw them speak out in the need that after close to 30 years of debating this, 20 years very specifically about whether or not members of the LGBT community should be included in it, it was finally time to pass this and move on. So I am hoping that we are beginning to turn the corner and that the business community will educate lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, frankly, why the business community supports diversity and inclusion and why they're moving from just diversity and inclusion to actually addressing issues of equity, which is a deeper understanding of marginalized communities and the support that we need to be able to be treated in a more even playing field with everyone else. And so those conversations will continue, but frankly, when you've got a big institution like the Georgia Chamber of Commerce that has a diversity and inclusion committee, they actually had Gabrielle present to that committee, I believe it was about a month ago, which frankly, if you think about where the Georgia Chamber was just a few years ago, is pretty remarkable that they would devote an entire session to understanding transgender and gender nonconforming issues here in Georgia and wanting to be better placed as the Georgia Chamber of Commerce to support advocates in our quest.
Well, and Gabrielle, what are you seeing? You work with corporations on a regular basis to help them understand more deeply about transgender and gender nonconforming folks in the workplace. What are you seeing? What are they asking you right now as you go into their companies to help them?
Well, I think the one thing that we've recognized is that everybody's a different place on this journey of inclusion, right? Creating this inclusive culture for LGBTQ, but in our specific lane, TGNC individuals. And so because they're at different places, a lot of times organizations don't know what they don't know. So it's having those conversations around, helping them understand to get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? The only way we're going to really make any significant change and move the needle and create these inclusive cultures that all of us are wanting to create in the workplace is by, having some difficult conversations. Now, that's not to say that you don't have them in the spirit of learning. You naturally have them in the spirit of learning, right? But, organizations are recognizing that, excuse me, this approach to an inclusive workplace culture is kind of like twofold. There's a personal competency track that organizations need to be mindful of, making sure that everyone in the organization understands how to, at a minimum, interact respectfully with LGBTQ and TGNC individuals, right? But beyond that, like Jeff was saying a little bit ago, they've got to look at the organizational competency as well. And a baseline is policy, right? So while HRC has done great work in creating the Corporate Equality Index, scoring 100 on that index is not all the work that you have to do, right? There's other work that you have to do around community engagement, policy development, inclusive facilities, talent acquisition, your marketing and communication efforts. Does a TGNC individual see themselves in your organization? And so, organizations are recognizing that this is not a 60 or 90-minute conversation. This is a commitment to a journey of transformation. And so they're recognizing that they need to be intentional in creating these spaces to have these types of conversations so that they can in fact create that inclusive workplace culture so that we can show up authentically without fear of trepidation.
Thank you for that, Gabrielle. And part of that goes into the changing climate culture of businesses, but also the changing culture and climate of Georgia. And I guess hearing both Gabrielle and Jeff chat about what they're seeing, Fred, it makes me wonder that as we become more of a purple state, is that going to open the door, do you think, to businesses being more apt to support and be more open about inclusive laws and policies?
Well, sure. I mean, I think that a lot of businesses know that inclusion is good for business, and I think a lot of employees want to be in places where they feel comfortable and where they feel safe, and so that applies to the workplace, and then it also applies to the broader environment, the broader culture. I think that every trans or gay person knows what it feels like to walk down the street in a place where you just generally feel safe, and it becomes all the more apparent when you're somewhere where you don't feel like that, right? So here in Atlanta, right, I think for the most part, it's not something that we tend to have to think about, right? But we don't have to go far when we're before we're like, oh goodness, okay, let me watch myself a little bit, and so the more signals that the state sends and that the city sends that we are in fact a safe and inclusive place, then the better that is, in my view, for economic development, for attracting businesses and for attracting talent, which when you attract talent, then you attract more businesses and so on and so forth. And there's a question to be had about what economic development is going to look like in a post-pandemic world, where I think you can imagine a world in which there is more focus on the talent pool and on the employees who aren't necessarily in the same place as where the headquarters or where the jobs technically are. And so, creating climates where folks from lots of different backgrounds feel comfortable and safe it's extremely important. And I think that the results tonight can be a part of a broader message that the state can send about how welcoming and inclusive it is.
And we often see that corporations will, file a front of the court brief, around something that they very much care about. Do you see this has been that narrative is starting to become more fleshed out as you see, as you have seen over the years, more and more of these briefs be filed in support of specific legislation?
Sure. Yes. So lots of businesses have been amici in important litigation regarding LGBTQ rights. Another player here, though, is the government. The United States government, and the Department of Justice is also a frequent amici in these cases, and helps to set the agenda, actually, of the Supreme Court docket, right? So, of course, there's 9 justices, but the Solicitor General is generally thought of as the 10th justice because they're given a great deal of deference about what cases the court should, in fact, hear. And so on the case that I mentioned, the foster care case that's being discussed tomorrow, for example, this particular Department of Justice has taken the side of the agency that wants to discriminate against Philadelphia, and not taking the side of Philadelphia in that particular case. And so that matters too, right? So so businesses, to answer your specific question, yes, Businesses, I think, over time have become more and more inclusive and are looking for ways to continue to do that. But there's some administrations where the government is itself also filing briefs on the side of equity and inclusion and equality, and other administrations where they either aren't in the picture or worse, are literally filing briefs on the side of exclusion.
So, we'll take both routes here, and would love all of your opinions on this. So, if Democrats win, in your opinion, what is the strategy for LGBTQ equity? How do we move forward?
Yeah, no, so I agree that that state and local elections are tremendously important, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. Right. So you say if Democrats win, I'm hopeful maybe tonight Democrats can take the state house, but if they don't, let's keep working on it. And if they do, let's start working on the state Senate and let's start working on, there's still a lot of opportunities here in Georgia, including, of course, the governor's race, which will be in 2 years. And not to bring up another election when we haven't finished this one. But there's always another one. And Georgia has a lot of room for improvement. So from a political standpoint, I would point to all of that. And then to policy, right? Jeff has been at the front lines of making sure that more and more municipalities across the state have non-discrimination policies, and it's important to continue that work and to have that be true in more and more places. I think that when it comes to nationally, not to, and democracy is one of those things that in a lot of policy conversations, there's not a lot of room for it because it's not, it covers everything, right? So, nonpartisan redistricting commissions, when do you talk about that unless you're literally having a panel about nonpartisan redistricting commissions? Partisan gerrymandering, where do you have that conversation unless you're literally having a conversation about partisan gerrymandering? But I do think that as a nation, I think there's a sense, an anxiety, and it's an anxiety that's not limited to the left or the right. There's an anxiety about a feeling of tremendous disconnection from important institutions, and including the government, and a sense that the government is this other thing, that it's no longer of the people, for the people, by the people, but instead it's some other project that average Americans are disconnected from. And I think we have to ask serious questions about how to reform democracy so that people feel more included, where people feel that their voice matters. Because I think that the more people who participate in the process, and the more people who feel that their voice matters, then that also will aid inclusion, that will aid equity, because often the people who feel the most left out and who don't participate are the people who have been subordinated, either in recent times or over the course of generations.
Yeah, and that's great, Fred. I mean, I love all your points that you made. There's a saying, you get in debt a lot quicker than you get out of debt. And so I think that there has been a wake of destruction that's kind of been created over the last 4 years. So there needs to be some reparations made as a result of the current administration's act toward the LGBTQ community, specifically the TGNC community. And so I think that there's some steps that can be taken to reinstate some protections that were in place that we experienced from the Obama administration, right? So, making sure that you're true to your word, and the things that you're saying that you're going to take care of, that you're in fact going to take care of. And I love the point that you made, Fred, in making sure that the folks that are not at the table are invited to the table, because at the end of the day, like Fred said, unless you feel like your voice is heard and you feel seen in the decision-making process, that continues to perpetuate an us and them culture, which I feel like has been perpetuated to a significant degree over the last 4 years. So, making sure that the right people are in the conversations, I think, is key, not only to not only to push a specific agenda, but to just do the right thing, right? So it's not about being on the left or the right necessarily, but it's about doing the right thing.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, and Gabrielle, I'm glad you brought it up. We need to make sure that if Democrats win on a federal level and have I think everybody agrees that the Democrats will retain control of the U.S. House. So what is in question is the U.S. Senate and the presidency. I think that if Democrats have all three, they need to prioritize LGBTQ protections. I've been doing this a long time. I can understand why 12 years ago, decision was made to focus on healthcare and passage of the Affordable Care Act as a priority that took us forward as a country in some very significant ways for a conversation that had gotten stuck in a rut over decades and was hurting tens of millions of people. But under the Obama administration, as great as they were, we still were not able to pass legislation other than the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Act, adding sexual orientation and gender identity to federal hate crimes law. There was nothing that was actually passed legislatively. There was a lot that was passed through administrative action, but we've seen that those administrative actions are all vulnerable to reversal and can have devastating consequences. So it is time for us to say, if Democrats win everything, we must get them to prioritize the passage of the Equality Act or other similar legislation that ensures not just access to employment, housing, and public accommodations, which are incredibly important, but the Affordable Care Act, the protections there. It was relying upon the Obama administration to have a definition of sex discrimination that was inclusive of gender, gender identity, sexual orientation. We need to codify that into law so that our rights are even more protected and are no longer dependent upon how an administration will identify and define terms or how courts will identify, determine, and define terms. We need these legislative protections. And I think a lot of folks, frankly, get surprised when you realize that on a federal level, there really has not been anything other than hate crimes that has been passed proactively that affects the LGBT community and offers protection. So we need to demand that on a local level. Georgia, best case scenario, Georgia is going to remain a purple state. So what I would ask Democrats, if we do flip the House here in Georgia, again, prioritizing our issues, and I think that they will, but to do this in a way that recognizes the bipartisan nature of our state and to try to bring LGBTQ issues in line with where public thinking is. Public thinking has broad support, whether folks are Democrats, Republicans, or independents. I think we need to encourage Democratic leaders as they are in ascendancy to power to resist the urge to use us and our community as a wedge issue against Republicans. Find ways to continue to work forward in a bipartisan manner. There's going to be plenty of credit to go around. We really need that. We deserve it. People are hurting because we don't have it. And so it will be asking them to just govern wisely and in such ways that we can move the ball forward for the LGBT community. And again, other marginalized groups that have been written on the sidelines. We've helped got the Democrats to power, but it's going to be a while before we could ever consider ourselves a solidly blue state. And so our communities really need this help, and that's going to require smart, good governance.
So staying on that, especially in terms of prioritization, and because, as you mentioned, that a lot of these, conversations where the public is on a lot of these different issues is really nonpartisan, it's bipartisan. So in your opinions, if Republicans win, what is the strategy for LGBTQ equality, equity, starting at the state level and going on up to the federal level?
Well, I think actually we've seen Republicans, especially Republicans in the House, that have expressed an interest in being supportive of pro-LGBT legislation. Has soundly rejected, the House has soundly rejected everything since 2016. So anything negative has been rejected in the House. Some of the most egregious bills that have been introduced the last couple of years have not even gotten hearings in the House. And so that is a marker that I think Republicans understand that their constituencies, especially in the North Metro Atlanta suburbs, where LGBTQ families are very much ingrained in the fabric of what's happening in suburbia, and that more and more of these families have transgender, gender nonconforming kids. And that is what is, I think, going to drive greater inclusion and support, specifically of the transgender community and gender nonconforming Georgians in policy conversations. We need to have that trickle over into the Senate some more substantial ways, but I do think that we're going to see some changes in the Senate this coming session, where the Senate is not just a place where good LGBT legislation goes to die, that we can have some conversations and again, start to see some bipartisan movement. So that actually is, the message is going to be the same to Republicans, that we know that this is no longer a wedge issue that you can win on. And it is time to start recognizing that a lot of folks who do vote Republican are also supportive of the LGBT community, and it's time to move on our issues.
Gabriel, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I thank you, Jeff, for sharing all that. You know, again, I go back to the power of visibility. You know, when we are present, then things do they change. And so perhaps this is an invitation for, you know, those in the LGBTQ community that are interested in getting involved in political office, that they start saying, okay, what do I need to do to prepare myself, to position myself in order to have a seat at the table, right? I mean, here's the reality. You're not necessarily going to get invited to the table. You've got to kind of say, I want to be at the table, right? And showing up in a way that you're showing up competently and you're bringing your whole self, your identity, and all the, you know, expertise that you bring to the conversation from an experiential level, I think will go a long way. So I see this as an invitation for those of us who may be interested in saying, okay, what's next for me? Saying, okay, I want to see at the table.
Thank you both. And Fred, I have a question to kind of round this out, is that, you know, we've talked about how business leaders have been out front on LGBTQ issues. You know, regardless of who wins, what should be part of a business's public agenda on LGBTQ issues moving forward, especially when it comes to influencing legislation or advancing the cause?
Yeah, so concretely, I mean, Georgia is one of a few states that has no anti-discrimination ordinance at the state level at all of any meaningful kind, right? In employment, let alone in public accommodation, and that's not just with respect to sexual orientation; it's also with respect to race and sex. So when I say at all, I mean at all. And so that would seem to be a meaningful starting point. I think that most people would agree. To Jeff's point, not asking for the moon here. I think most people would agree that a law that says that you shouldn't discriminate on the basis of race, sex, religion, sexual orientation, and disability. That should be the law everywhere, including in Georgia. And so I think we should see movement on that in employment at the very least. And I also think there should be a conversation about how to do that with respect to public accommodations in a way that is sensitive to meaningful and religious organizations and churches and their religious faith. In addition, you know, I'd say that, in fact, I would call that actually, I'm just making this term up here on the spot, but I would call that, you know, a first generation type of law, you know, referring to kind of a 1964 style anti-discrimination law. I think we also need to be thinking about second generation issues, and by that I mean things that disproportionately impact LGBTQ folks, even if it's not targeted at LGBTQ folks. So when it comes to questions about affordable housing, you know, LGBT youth are often kicked out of their homes. LGBT seniors may not always feel particularly equally comfortable in places that are built as senior housing, and sort of kind of making sure that in people's golden years and in people's earlier years that they have safe places to live through thoughtful and comprehensive affordable housing policies and policies that are conscious of and literate of the unique issues that LGBTQ folks face. I think that should be an important part of the agenda as well. And so, so there's some issues that I think like they're not, and I mean, I named one in terms of housing, I could name others in terms of healthcare, et cetera, where LGBTQ folks feel things sometimes more acutely. And so kind of those sort of affirmative sets of policies, which I'll call second generation types of issues, I think are really important as well.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really great way to put it. And to pivot, I want to get into this conversation that we've all been having around this surge of civic participation. In 2017, 2018, the LGBTQ Institute conducted a Southern survey along with Georgia Equality, who helped serve as a partner for that. And we surveyed over 6,500 LGBTQ Southerners. Even at that time, 93% responded, of the survey respondents reported that they were registered to vote. And in 2016, 90% of them said that they had registered to vote. My question is that given the surge of voting, how do we translate this civic mindedness into sustained wins for equality? How do we do that?
I think Gabriella said it earlier. It's showing up. And it's continuing to show up. I think what makes the difference here in Georgia and where we will continue to see a greater responsiveness is that people are running as candidates. This year, I should have actually said it as one of the things I'm hopeful for about tonight, that barring an unforeseen disaster, we will end up with a record 7 out legislators. 6 in the House. We're going to expand that by 1 with Marvin Lim, who is running unopposed up in Gwinnett County, as well as our first out state senator with Kim Jackson, who is running in a very heavily Democratic district. She has a token Republican opposition, but it's really hard to believe that the Republican has a chance to win in that race. And so I think just like the presence of Carla Drenner 20 years ago began to shift the tone of the Georgia House, having Kim Jackson in the Georgia Senate will begin to shift the tone there as well. The fact that she is a Black woman, the fact that she is an ordained Episcopal priest, just adds more weight to everything that she will say. And the Senate, where has been a place where a lot of legislation that uses religion as a weapon against us has originated, I think to have that strong progressive faith voice sitting right there with the other 55 senators, regardless of anything else that happens, that's going to begin to shift the conversation here in Georgia. But people are showing up. They are campaign staff. They are campaign managers. They are volunteers. They are poll workers. That's how we make it sustainable. We need to not just be there in the voting booth every 2 or 4 years. We need to be there all the time, and not just in the voting booth. We need to be down, when it's safe to do so, walk in the halls of the Georgia legislature, walk in the halls of City Hall, walking the halls of county commissions, and not just here in the metro Atlanta area, but around the entire state.
Yeah, and I will add to that, it's like, I think we need to be very conscientious and intentional in bringing the allies along with us, because we cannot do this by ourselves. This is a heavy lift. And so, making sure that those family members, those loved ones are a part of the conversation, that we're pulling them in, making them a part of the solution, helping them see the weight of their vote, the weight of their involvement, the weight of their voice, right? Because at the end of the day, you know, we're a small demographic from the perspective of the entire, human representation here in the country, and allyship is, you know, is huge. So making sure that we're pulling them into the conversation, I think, is going to be key.
Fred, what are your thoughts on how we continue to sustain wins for equality through this surge in civic participation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's about continuing to build on the momentum, and so I think that if there are the kind of gains that are expected tonight electorally, then people are gonna expect results. There's a lot of new voters. In Georgia in particular, right? So. Not including election day, as we're calling it for whatever reason today, rather than the last day to vote. And so excluding election day, there are 3.95 million people in Georgia who have already voted. And although that is a remarkable stat, I will tell you a number that I am way more moved by, which is that 1.2 million of them didn't vote 4 years ago in Georgia. They may have voted somewhere, but they didn't vote in Georgia. And over 1 million didn't vote 2 years ago in the Abrams election. All right, so we're talking about, so just for context, that means 28% of the people who have voted didn't vote in Georgia 4 years ago. So these are new folks. They're new to our process, even if they're not new generally to the electoral process. And they're going to expect results. And we have a unique opportunity to deliver them and to show that it matters. And so to me, it's about making sure that we're being attentive to that fact, that we're being responsible about that, and that we're being responsive to them so that they will stay in this process.
I think that's a great point, is that once you win, you have to govern and you have to produce results. So the last question to each of you, it's a two-part question. What will you be watching for tonight as returns come in, number one? And then number two, how are you practicing self-care in this moment of anxiety?
Frankly, this is self-care. I'm so anxious today, and there's only so much you can do at this point. And so it's like, so that it's, I can usually, oh, maybe I'll host a fundraiser and like, oh, let me think about said fundraiser. Who should I, anyway, there's things that you can do to sort of distract, I'm like, oh, I want to take water and pizza to people who are in long lines. It doesn't look like there are long lines because people have already voted. So this is great. This is a self-care activity. But beyond that, I think we have to remember to hold the people who we love close, and to look out for each other, and to remember that as important as policy and politics are, and they are deeply important, and they have life or death consequences, that throughout all of that, it's even more important that we hold our loved ones close. In saying that, I didn't intend to go there, but I can't say those words and look at Jeff without extending my condolences to you for your loss, your recent loss. And so those, as a community, we also need to wrap our arms around one another more broadly, and be each other's family. And so that's my answer to the self-care question.
Thanks, Fred, and I appreciate that. I think with self-care, what I encourage people to do is look at the bigger picture. Realize that regardless of who will be the president for the next 4 years, here in Georgia, we have one. As Fred already said, over 3.9 million people early voted. We are well on our way towards shattering all voting records. That's people showing up. That's people paying attention. That's already winning there. I think understanding that, yes, if we have 4 more years of the Trump administration. It is going to be challenging and it will be difficult, but we are incredibly resilient people. We will survive that. We will come together as a community to continue to resist efforts to demonize and dehumanize specifically the transgender community. And we need to recognize that, again, we have already won. All of the major Democratic candidates running for the US Senate are actively speaking on LGBTQ issues. I've been doing this for a long time. That is the first time in Georgia history that US Senate candidates on the Democratic side have been so outspoken and articulate with their support of LGBT issues. So even if they don't end up winning their races ultimately, that has moved the needle, and we need to recognize that that's a very significant step forward. We have already won.
Jeff, thank you for that, because, I mean, thank you for acknowledging those challenges that the transgender nonconforming community faces and for your advocacy for that. You know, for me, part of my self-care is knowing that, you know, I went to the mat, that I did all I could do. And like Jeff says, to understand that you can only control what you can control and continue showing up and being visible. But recognizing also that if we have 4 more years, there's so much work to be done, right? And which is an invitation to all of us to continue leaning in, doing what is ours to do, being visible, being that voice in the room. And I love what Fred said, making sure you're surrounding yourself with folks, because at the end of the day, we're going to need to have we're going to need some time to kind of, you know, support ourselves, right? Just to make sure and check in with each other, making sure that we're okay, right? So yeah, I'd echo everything that was said in addition to that.
Gabrielle, Fred, Jeff, thank you so much for being here today. I want to just remind folks that we are going to be live on November 17th for our post-election forecast, which will be real interesting considering what happens tonight. Again, that's November 17th, 2 p.m. Eastern time. You can register at lgbtqbusinessforum.org. Again, thank you to the panelists who joined me today on a very historic day. And I wish all of you a good night. And I hope that everyone, if you haven't voted already, goes out and votes. So thank you so much.